Join me as I dive into the creepiest cemetery stories that are sure to give me chills and keep me up all night. From the eerie feeling you get when walking past a rundown graveyard to the spine-tingling tales of ghostly apparitions, cemetery stories have captivated people's imagination for centuries. There's something about these hallowed grounds that sparks our curiosity, drawing us in with an otherworldly fascination. Cemeteries have always been a hotbed of paranormal activity. People often report seeing ghostly apparitions, disembodied voices, and unexplained noises that seem to emanate from beyond the grave. Some claim to have encountered malevolent spirits, while others speak of benevolent entities that offer comfort and solace. But what is it about cemeteries that makes them such a hub of supernatural activity? Perhaps it's the sense of reverence, the feeling that we're walking on sacred ground, that awakens our primal fears. Whatever the reason, cemeteries have a certain allure to them, a blend of the macabre and the fascinating that draws us in, despite our reservations. And it's this morbid curiosity that drives us to seek out the most spine-tingling, bone-chilling tales of cemetery hauntings. From grave desecrations to mysterious apparitions, these stories have the power to captivate and terrify us in equal measure. I've heard stories of people who dared to venture into a cemetery at night, only to be confronted by an otherworldly presence that left them shaken. Others speak of strange rituals and ceremonies that take place under the cover of darkness, rituals that awaken powers best left dormant. And then, of course, there are the countless reports of ghostly children, lost souls trapped between worlds, who beckon to the living with a haunting, ethereal cry. In one famous cemetery, there's said to be a grave that's cursed, a final resting place that's home to a malevolent entity that's rumored to exact a terrible revenge on anyone who disturbs its slumber. People claim to have seen strange lights emanating from the grave, heard disembodied whispers that seem to issue a dire warning. And yet, despite the warnings, people continue to flock to the grave, drawn by a morbid curiosity that borders on the suicidal. But there's one story that stands head and shoulders above the rest, a tale of horror so profound that it's said to haunt the dreams of anyone who dares to hear it. It's the story of a cemetery that's home to a portal to the other side, a gateway that's guarded by an entity of unimaginable power. People claim to have seen shadowy figures emerging from the portal, figures that seem to blend with the darkness itself, leaving only a faint, hellish glow in their wake. The story goes that if you dare to approach the portal, you'll be met by an unspeakable horror that will drive you to the brink of madness. And yet, despite the warnings, people continue to venture into the cemetery, drawn by a fascination that's both terrifying and compelling. As we delve deeper into the world of cemetery hauntings, it's clear that there's a common thread that connects these stories, a fascination with the unknown, a desire to push beyond the boundaries of what's considered safe and sane. Whether it's the thrill of the unknown or the rush of adrenaline that comes with facing our deepest fears, cemetery stories have a way of drawing us in, of capturing our imagination in a way that few other things can. So what's your own experience with spooky cemetery stories? Have you ever ventured into a haunted graveyard, or stumbled upon a mysterious tombstone that seemed to hold a hidden secret? Let me know in the comments section below. And don't forget to check out my other videos for more thrilling tales of the paranormal and the unknown. Part 1: The Whispering Stones. I'll never forget the first time I walked past the cemetery on the outskirts of our town. It was dusk, that liminal moment when the sky bleeds into twilight, and the world feels on the edge of something. I wasn't planning to linger, but something drew me closer. The wrought iron gates, rusted with age, seemed to groan in the wind, and the gravestones jutted out of the ground like jagged teeth. There was something wrong about this place. Maybe it was the way the air seemed colder around the headstones, or the way the trees loomed, skeletal and barren, casting long, finger-like shadows. Or maybe it was the whispers. Yeah, the whispers. It started as a faint murmur, so soft that I could have dismissed it as the wind. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became, an unintelligible stream of voices, all speaking at once, just beneath the surface of hearing. I couldn't understand a word, but they sounded angry or maybe desperate. It was like they were trying to warn me, but of what, I had no idea. Against my better judgment, I found myself stepping closer to the gate. I don't know why. Curiosity, I guess. Or maybe it was something else. My breath clouded in front of me, and I realized I was shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something primal. I wasn't alone. At first, I didn't see her, just a fleeting shadow between the stones. My heart slammed against my ribs as I strained to see through the gloom. There, standing between two of the older graves, was a figure. A woman. She wore a tattered dress that fluttered in the breeze, her long hair hanging limp over her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at something I couldn't see. And then, without a sound, she lifted her head. Her eyes, God, her eyes were hollow, empty pits, black as the deepest part of the night. I froze, unable to look away, as she slowly raised one hand and pointed at me. My skin crawled as I realized the whispers had grown louder, almost frantic. "Get out!" The voices seemed to scream, though no actual words passed my ears. My legs moved before my brain caught up. I stumbled back, my shoes crunching against the gravel as I fled from the cemetery. The wind howled, and for a split second I swore I heard something else, a laugh, low and mocking, like the graveyard itself was amused by my fear. But as I reached the main road, gasping for breath, I turned back one last time. The woman was gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it was stronger now. I'd escaped for now, but I knew I had been marked. Whatever lived in that cemetery, whatever power held sway over the dead, it had seen me. And it wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Part 2. The Grave That Weeps. I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, the whispering wind, the eerie shadows, the woman with the hollow eyes. It had to be stress, or maybe the influence of one too many late-night horror movies. For days, I avoided even going near the cemetery. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. It started with small things. The house felt colder, especially at night. I'd hear faint creaks and whispers in the dark, but every time I got up to check, I'd find nothing. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Then came the dreams, vivid, terrifying dreams of the cemetery, of wandering through endless rows of graves, each one whispering my name. In the worst dream, I stood in front of a particular grave. It wasn't one I recognized, but something about it felt familiar. The headstone was ancient, worn smooth by time, but there was a name carved into it. My name. And beneath it, an inscription, "She will come for you." I always woke up in a cold sweat after that, my heart racing, the taste of dirt on my tongue. One evening, about a week after my encounter, I got a call from my friend, Danny. We'd known each other since we were kids, and he was one of the few people I trusted to talk about the strange things happening to me. I didn't mention the cemetery at first, just told him about the odd noises and the dreams. He listened in silence, then surprised me by asking a question that chilled me to the bone. "Have you been to the old cemetery recently?" My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't told anyone about that night. How could he know? Yeah, I walked past it." "Why?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Danny finally spoke again, his voice was low, serious in a way I wasn't used to. "You shouldn't have gone there. No one goes there anymore, not since it happened." "What happened?" I asked, my stomach twisting with dread. "There's a grave there. They call it the Weeping Grave. People say it's cursed, that if you visit it at night you'll see her, the woman who never left. They say she cries for those who disturb her, and that if you hear her crying, you'll die." I laughed, though it sounded forced, hollow. "You can't be serious." "I wish I wasn't," Danny said. "I heard the stories growing up, but I didn't believe them until my cousin Greg." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What about Greg?" "He went to the cemetery. Late at night. A bunch of us dared him to do it. We were just being dumb kids, you know. Anyway, he came back pale as a sheet, wouldn't say a word. A few days later he started talking about a woman, said he could see her in his room, crying at the foot of his bed. I didn't like where this was going. What happened to him?" Danny's voice broke. He hung himself. Just like that. No signs, no warnings. He was fine one day, and the next, gone. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to say something, anything to dismiss his story as nonsense, but the memory of that woman, her hollow eyes locked on mine, came rushing back with terrifying clarity. I didn't see her crying, I whispered, more to myself than to Danny. Then you might still be okay, he said. But if you hear her cry, you need to leave. Get out of the house. Go somewhere, anywhere, but don't stay near her. The conversation left me shaken. I tried to go about my evening, but every little sound seemed amplified, every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the wind. By the time midnight rolled around, I was wide awake, too anxious to sleep. And that's when I heard it. A faint sobbing sound, almost too soft to notice, carried on the wind. It was coming from outside, somewhere in the distance, but as I stood there, frozen in place, it grew louder. The crying was moving closer. Part 3: The Crying Woman. The sound of the crying sent a bolt of ice through my veins. I stood there, motionless, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was hearing. It couldn't be real, it couldn't be. But the sobbing continued, growing louder with every second, as though the woman was drawing nearer to my house, her sorrow spilling into the air. I don't know how long I stood there, just listening, the low, pitiful weeping filling the room. My feet felt glued to the floor, my body refusing to obey the screaming commands of my mind to move. My throat tightened as panic took hold. This was exactly what Danny had warned me about. I stumbled to the window, heart pounding so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. For a moment, I almost yanked back the curtains to look outside, to see if there really was someone out there. But Danny's voice echoed in my head, "Don't look. Don't ever look." I couldn't take my eyes off the curtains, though. Beyond them, I imagined her, standing in the yard, staring up at my window, her hollow eyes fixed on me. The crying wasn't just louder now, it was sharper, almost like she was in pain. A part of me thought, what if she just needs help? What if... Stop. Don't be stupid. With trembling hands, I backed away from the window, trying to make as little noise as possible. My breath came in short, jagged gasps, and all I could hear was that damned crying, rising and falling like some horrible song. I needed to do something, anything, to break the spell she was casting over me. Suddenly, the sobbing stopped. For a moment I didn't move. The silence was so complete, I wondered if I had just imagined everything. Maybe the crying was just a figment of my overactive imagination, maybe I dozed off and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I... The doorknob rattled. I froze, staring at the door across the room. The sound was faint at first, a gentle testing of the handle, but then it became more urgent, as though someone on the other side was trying to force their way in. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." The handle twisted again. Then came a soft knock, so quiet that I could barely hear it, like the sound of fingernails tapping lightly on the wood. My knees buckled. I backed into the corner of the room, pulling my legs to my chest, unable to tear my eyes away from the door. My mind raced with 1,000 frantic thoughts. How could she be here? How did she find me? The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, trying to pretend this wasn't happening. But it was happening. The air in the room had grown so cold that I could see my breath puffing out in front of me, little clouds of frost hanging in the air. My teeth began to chatter as the knocking grew louder, more forceful. Thud. It wasn't a knock anymore. It was a full-body slam. The door shook in its frame, the handle rattling violently. I squeezed my eyes shut, rocking back and forth, whispering to myself, "Please go away. Please go away." The door groaned under the weight of another hit, and then another. It wouldn't hold much longer. I could hear her now, breathing on the other side, labored and ragged. Every few seconds, a sob broke through the door, muffled but unmistakable. And then, it stopped. The silence was worse. It was as though every sound had been swallowed by the darkness. I could feel her, though, standing right there on the other side of the door. Waiting. Listening. Tears ran down my face as I slowly opened my eyes. The door looked as though it hadn't been touched, but I knew better. I knew she was there, waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. I started to rise to my feet, my legs shaky, but as I did, I noticed something. There, near the bottom of the door, just visible in the dim light, was a shadow, long and slender, stretching into the room. It moved slowly, deliberately, creeping across the floor as if it was reaching for me. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the shadow inch closer. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from whatever was out there. But I couldn't move. The shadow stopped, just inches from my foot. Then, a whisper. "I'm sorry." The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. It was her. And she was right outside my door. Part 4. The Cold Hand. The whispered apology sent a shiver through me that reached deep into my bones. I stood there, pressed against the corner of my room, staring down at the shadow that hovered just inches from my feet. The air had grown so thick with tension, it felt like I was drowning in it. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but fear had locked me in place. The door groaned again, softly this time, as if whatever was behind it was gently pressing against the wood. I could still hear her breathing, labored, shallow breaths that sounded almost like gasps. My mind raced, scrambling to make sense of the situation, but nothing made sense anymore. The crying had stopped, replaced by that soft, desperate breathing. She was waiting. Waiting for me to acknowledge her, to make the first move. And I knew, deep down, that if I made a sound, if I so much as whispered her name, I'd open the door to something far worse than I could imagine. And then it happened. The shadow moved again, slowly extending toward me, stretching unnaturally along the floor, as though it was reaching for my leg. My skin crawled as I watched it, my pulse quickening. I pressed myself harder into the wall, trying to distance myself from it, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. I clamped my hand over my mouth, suppressing the scream that threatened to burst from my throat. The shadow's movement was so deliberate, so hungry, it felt like it was savoring the fear that was radiating off me. I closed my eyes. But the air in the room seemed to change as I did. The cold deepened, wrapping around me like an icy embrace. My breath came in ragged gasps, and just as I was about to move, to do anything to escape the nightmare, I felt it, a touch. A cold hand closed around my ankle. I screamed then, the sound escaping me before I could stop it. My eyes shot open, but there was nothing, just the same shadow stretching across the floor. I kicked, trying to shake the icy grip, but the hand tightened, holding me fast in place. My heart raced as panic took over, and I clawed at the floor, desperate to pull myself away from whatever was touching me. The coldness spread up my leg, like ice water pouring through my veins, and I could feel it, the weight of something pulling me, trying to drag me toward the door. I thrashed, gasping for air, kicking wildly at the invisible grip, but it wouldn't let go. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the hand released me. I scrambled backward, gasping and shaking, trying to process what had just happened. My leg throbbed with cold, the sensation lingering long after the hand had disappeared. I looked at the door again, half expecting it to burst open, but it remained closed. The shadow, too, had vanished, as though it had never been there at all. But I knew it had. I could still feel it. I could still feel her, watching, waiting, testing the limits of how far she could reach into my world. The room felt oppressive now, suffocating, like the walls were closing in. I needed to get out. I couldn't stay here. Not with her just outside the door. Grabbing my phone from the nightstand, I fumbled to dial Danny's number. The line rang once, then twice, and I silently prayed he'd pick up. By the third ring, I was ready to hang up and run. But just as I moved to end the call, I heard his voice. "Hello?" He answered groggily, obviously half asleep. "Danny." My voice cracked. I was barely holding it together. "It's happening. She's here." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear Danny's mind racing to catch up. You heard her? He asked, his voice now sharp, alert. She touched me. I choked out, glancing toward the door again. She's right outside, Danny. She's trying to get in. Get out of there. No, he said, his voice rising in panic. Don't wait, just go. I can't, I stammered. What if she… I don't care, he interrupted. Get out of the house. Don't let her take you. My heart pounded in my chest as his words sank in. I knew he was right. I had to leave. Now. I didn't wait for Danny to say anything else. I grabbed my coat and bolted for the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Every second felt like an eternity, and I half expected to feel her cold hand on my shoulder before I could get the door open. But somehow, I managed to unlock it. The door swung open with a loud creak, and I stumbled outside into the freezing night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. The street was deserted, dark except for a few flickering streetlights. My legs felt like jelly as I sprinted down the sidewalk, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not until I was far, far away from that house, and her. It wasn't until I reached the park at the end of the block that I finally collapsed, gasping for breath. My hands were still trembling, and I realized I'd left my phone back at the house. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting away. As I sat there, hunched over on the cold bench, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable, the sound of someone crying. She had followed me. Part 5, The Pursuit. The sobbing drifted through the night, faint but unmistakable, echoing off the buildings like some disembodied wail. My chest tightened as I sat there on the cold bench, my breath hanging in the frigid air, eyes wide as I scanned the empty park. I wanted to believe it was the wind, or maybe even a stray animal crying in the night. But deep down, I knew better. She was here. She had followed me. I jumped to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. The cold, mournful sobs grew louder, closer, as if she was just out of sight, hiding in the shadows between the trees. It was the same cry I had heard from the other side of my door, that hollow, grief-stricken wail that chilled me to my core. But out here, it was worse. It was no longer muffled by walls. Out here, it felt like she was hunting me. I spun around, my heart racing, eyes darting between the looming shapes of the trees and the park benches. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every gust of wind felt like cold fingers brushing against my skin. The streetlights above flickered, casting the world in a sickly, dim glow, and for a moment I thought I saw her, a pale figure standing between two trees, her dark hair billowing in the wind, eyes as black as the night. I didn't wait to get a better look. I turned and ran. The pavement beneath my feet seemed to stretch on forever, each step harder than the last as I sprinted down the empty street. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to be anywhere but here. I could hear the sobbing behind me, growing louder and louder, as if she was gaining on me. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. The night swallowed me whole. Street after street blurred together as I ran, my mind a panicked mess of thoughts, none of them making any sense. I needed to think, needed a plan, but all I could focus on was her, the woman with hollow eyes and her terrible, sorrow-filled cry. I didn't even realize I was running toward the cemetery until I saw the iron gates looming in front of me. I stopped dead in my tracks, panting and gasping for breath as I stared at the gates. The cemetery was the last place I wanted to be, but there was something about it that seemed to draw me in. A sense of inevitability, like this was where it had all started and where it would end. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves on the ground, and I felt the icy chill of her presence behind me. She was coming. Without thinking, I pushed the gate open with a loud creak and stumbled inside. The cemetery was eerily silent, the headstones bathed in pale moonlight, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The trees here were skeletal, their bare branches reaching into the sky like gnarled hands. The air was heavy, oppressive, as though the very ground itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. I made my way deeper into the cemetery, my footsteps crunching on the frost-covered grass. I knew I should keep running, find some place to hide, but something in the back of my mind was telling me to stop. To face her. The crying had faded again, but the weight of her presence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I could feel her, moving between the graves, slipping through the shadows, watching me. The old church at the center of the cemetery came into view, its crumbling stone walls half hidden by the overgrowth of ivy. It stood there like a forgotten relic, untouched by time, its weathered door barely hanging on its hinges. I hurried toward it, the sobbing growing louder again, following me through the gravestones like a relentless tide. Just as I reached the door, I felt it, her cold breath on the back of my neck. I screamed, stumbling forward as I threw open the door and slammed it shut behind me. The inside of the church was dark, the faint moonlight filtering through the broken windows casting eerie patterns on the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door, listening for any sign of her outside. Silence. I exhaled shakily, leaning against the wall for support. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had she followed me? What did she want? And why, of all places, had I come here? The church felt wrong, like the air itself was thick with decay, the walls creaking as if they were alive. Something about this place was off, more than just age and neglect. Then I heard it. A whisper. Faint, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. I'm sorry. My blood turned to ice. She wasn't outside the church anymore. She was in here. The sobbing started again, echoing through the darkened hall. I turned slowly, my heart thudding painfully in my chest as I stared into the shadows. There, at the far end of the church, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. The same woman, her long black hair hanging over her face, her dress tattered and torn, like she had crawled from the grave. She was standing by the altar, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The temperature in the room plummeted, the air so cold it felt like my skin was burning. I couldn't take my eyes off her as she slowly lifted her head, her empty, hollow eyes locking onto mine. I'm sorry, she whispered again, her voice cracking with sorrow. And then, with a sudden jolt, she began to move toward me. Part 6. The Grasp of the Dead. My body froze in place as I watched her glide toward me, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. Each step seemed to stretch out into eternity, the hollow emptiness of her eyes fixed on mine, her sorrow radiating from her like a suffocating mist. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was rooted to the spot, helpless against the force drawing me in. Her dress, torn and ragged, trailed behind her like a shroud, and her feet, she wasn't walking. She was floating, barely an inch off the ground, the fabric of her gown whispering against the stone floor with every movement. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the weight of her presence was pressing down on me, paralyzing me with fear. The closer she came, the colder the room grew, until my breath was visible in the air, thick plumes of frost swirling around me. I could barely feel my fingers anymore, my limbs growing numb from the cold and from terror. My back pressed hard against the stone wall of the church, but there was nowhere else to go. I'm sorry, she whispered again, her voice cracking, as though she was choking on the words. I wanted to ask why was she sorry? What did she want from me? But my throat tightened, no sound escaping as I struggled to find my voice. Her face was clearer now, her features pale and gaunt, skin stretched tightly over her bones. There was a sadness there, a deep, haunting sorrow, but beneath it, something darker, something that terrified me even more. She stopped a few feet in front of me, her head tilted slightly to the side as she stared into my eyes. For a moment, there was only silence, the world outside the church forgotten. Just the two of us, locked in this horrific, surreal moment. Then, slowly, she raised her hand. The same cold hand that had gripped my ankle earlier. The air seemed to pulse around me as her fingers stretched toward me, long and skeletal, tipped with blackened nails. A part of me screamed to move, to push her away, to escape, but my body refused to obey. I could only watch, helpless, as her hand inched closer, the cold radiating from it, freezing the air between us. And then, she touched me. Her fingers brushed against my cheek, icy and lifeless, and the instant they made contact, a flood of images overwhelmed my mind. Horrific, disjointed flashes of death, sorrow, and regret. I saw her, not as a ghost but as she once was, a living woman, alone and desperate, weeping over an unmarked grave, her hands stained with blood. I felt her pain, her longing, her regret so intense it nearly crushed me. But there was something else, something darker lurking beneath the sadness. An anger. A rage. Her hand slid down from my cheek to my throat, her grip tightening slowly. My chest heaved, struggling for breath as her icy fingers wrapped around my neck, squeezing. Her hollow eyes bore into mine, and I could feel her fury rising, boiling beneath the surface of her sorrow. I could barely breathe, the cold seeping into my bones, my vision blurring as black spots danced in front of my eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but this time the words were filled with bitterness, with hate. I choked, my hands weakly grasping at her arm, but it was like trying to move stone. She was too strong, too powerful. My lungs burned as I struggled for air, the pressure on my throat increasing with every passing second. I could feel myself slipping, the edges of my consciousness fraying as darkness crept in from the corners of my vision. And then, a voice. "Let her go." It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the haze of my fading mind. The grip around my throat loosened, and the woman's head snapped to the side, her hollow eyes narrowing as she looked toward the altar. I gasped, drawing in a ragged breath, my legs trembling as I sagged against the wall. Standing by the altar, bathed in the dim moonlight filtering through the broken windows, was another figure. A man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadow. His voice was calm, steady, but there was something about him that filled the room with a different kind of cold. Not the bitter chill of the woman's presence, but something ancient, something darker. The woman's gaze shifted between me and the man, her sorrowful expression twisting into something more desperate, almost pleading. She took a step back, her hand falling to her side, but she didn't disappear. She lingered there, hovering between us, as though unsure of what to do next. The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've done enough," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Leave her." For a moment, the woman hesitated. Her hollow eyes flicked back to mine, and I could feel the weight of her sorrow crashing into me again, the regret, the pain, and the rage swirling together into something too powerful to understand. But then, slowly, she began to fade. Her form dissolved into the shadows, her figure evaporating like smoke until there was nothing left but the cold, empty air. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The man didn't move. He stood there, watching me from the shadows, his face still hidden, his presence as unsettling as the woman's had been. Who are you?" I managed to croak, my throat still raw from her grip. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing through the empty church. I scrambled to my feet, desperate for answers, but my legs were weak, barely able to hold me up. Just before he reached the door, he stopped and turned slightly, his face still hidden in shadow. "You should never have gone to the cemetery," he said, his voice a low murmur that barely reached my ears. "Some things can't be undone." And then, just like the woman, he was gone. The church was silent again, but the weight of what had just happened still pressed down on me, the cold clinging to my skin. I stood there, alone in the darkness, trying to make sense of it all, but the only thing I knew for certain was that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Part 7. The Man in the Shadows. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to steady my breath, but the fear still clung to me, thick as smoke. The church was empty now, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were still holding on to the memory of what had just happened. My mind raced, replaying the encounter with the woman, the cold grasp of her hand, the visions she forced into my head. But it was the man, the stranger in the shadows, that unnerved me the most. Who was he? Why had he intervened? And what had he meant when he said, "Some things can't be undone"? I needed answers, but the longer I stood there, the more I realized I wasn't going to find them in that church. The silence was too thick, too absolute. It felt like the building was waiting for something else, another horror to unfold. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting in ways they shouldn't. It wasn't safe here. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I staggered toward the door. The air outside was bitterly cold, but it felt refreshing compared to the suffocating atmosphere of the church. I paused at the gate of the cemetery, glancing back at the crumbling structure, half expecting to see the woman or the man standing in the doorway, watching me. But there was nothing. Just darkness. The streets were eerily quiet as I made my way home, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. My head throbbed with a dull, insistent ache, the remnants of the terrifying encounter still buzzing in my mind. Everything felt wrong. I felt wrong, like something had shifted inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though the streets were deserted. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see a shadow following me, slipping between the lampposts, lurking just out of sight. I finally reached my house, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My hands shook as I fumbled with the key, and I practically fell through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The familiar surroundings of my living room did little to ease the terror that had latched itself to me. I locked the door, double-checking it before backing away, my eyes scanning every corner of the room, half expecting the cold hand to reach out for me again. My phone buzzed, pulling me from the spiral of fear. It was Danny. "Did you get out?" he asked as soon as I picked up, his voice tight with worry. "Yeah, I got out," I whispered, sinking onto the couch. "But Danny, there was this man. He told her to stop, told her to leave. And she did." There was silence on the other end of the line. When Danny finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more serious. "A man? What did he look like?" "I don't know," I said, rubbing my forehead. "I couldn't see his face. He stayed in the shadows. But he knew her, Danny. He knew what she was. He said I should never have gone to the cemetery." Danny cursed under his breath. "I don't like this. I don't like any of this. We need to figure out who he is. If he knew her, maybe he knows what she wants. What if he's like her?" I asked, the thought making my stomach churn. "I don't know," Danny admitted. "But he didn't hurt you, right? He helped you. Maybe that's something." Maybe. I wasn't convinced. The man's presence had been as unsettling as the woman's. There was something about him that felt off. Dark. "I'll look into it," Danny said. "But you need to stay safe. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't go back to the cemetery." "You don't have to tell me twice," I muttered, glancing out the window. The street outside was empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. But I could still feel it, that nagging sensation that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. After hanging up with Danny, I locked every door and window in the house. My heart pounded as I walked through each room, checking and rechecking, making sure nothing was out of place. The house felt too quiet, the shadows too thick. My mind played tricks on me. Every creak, every rustle in the wind sent my nerves into overdrive. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, about the way his voice had cut through the woman's rage so effortlessly. Whoever he was, he had power. And that scared me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw her face, the hollow eyes, the desperate sorrow etched into her features. And worse, I felt her hand, icy and unyielding, closing around my throat. My dreams were filled with visions of graves, of death, and of whispers I couldn't understand. By the time morning came, I was more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. I didn't leave the house that day, too paranoid to even step onto the porch. The daylight did little to ease my nerves, and I found myself jumping at every little noise, every passing shadow. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long once again, there was a knock at my door. My heart seized in my chest. I stared at the door, dread creeping over me. The knock came again, 3 short raps, soft but insistent. For a moment, I considered not answering. But something told me I needed to see who was there. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward the door, my hand hovering over the knob. I hesitated, the memory of that cold hand on my throat flashing in my mind. What if it was her? But it wasn't her. I pulled the door open, and there, standing on my porch, was the man from the church. The shadows clung to him like a second skin, and even in the fading light, his face was still obscured. His presence sent a cold shiver down my spine, but there was something in his stance that stopped me from slamming the door in his face. He didn't seem angry. Just calm. Too calm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and measured. My throat went dry. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he stepped forward, his face still hidden in shadow. "I'm the one who watches," he said. "And I'm here to tell you that she's not finished with you." Part 8. The Watcher. I stood frozen at the door, my pulse thudding in my ears. The man's words hung in the air like a curse. "She's not finished with you." Every instinct screamed at me to shut the door, to lock him out, but I couldn't. Something about him, his calmness, his presence, held me there, rooted in place. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The man stepped into the doorway, the shadows clinging to him as if they were a part of him. His face was still hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me, studying me. There was something unnatural about the way he moved, like the shadows were guiding him, as if he didn't fully belong in the world of the living. "She's tethered to you now," he said, his tone unnervingly steady. "You've seen her, and worse, you've allowed her to touch you. That connection, it cannot be easily severed." My breath hitched in my throat. "But you stopped her. You made her leave." "For now," he replied, his voice darkening. "But she will return. She always does." I swallowed hard, my thoughts racing. "Who is she? Why is she after me?" The man was silent for a long moment, and for the first time, I noticed the faint sound of the wind outside, brushing through the trees like a soft whisper. He finally spoke, his voice low and distant, as if recalling something from long ago. "She was once like you," he said, his words heavy with sorrow. "Curious. Drawn to the cemetery, to the graves that weep. But she didn't stop at curiosity. She searched deeper, uncovered things she wasn't meant to see. And in doing so, she opened a door." A door. My mind flashed back to the strange pull I'd felt when I first wandered too close to the cemetery, how I had been drawn there against my better judgment. And now, it was as if I'd crossed some invisible threshold without even realizing it. "What did she find?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Death," he said simply. "But not the kind that comes quietly, not the peaceful sleep that welcomes the weary. She found a death that clings, a death that doesn't let go. And now she is bound to the place she once disturbed, trapped between worlds, seeking release." His words chilled me to the core. The woman I had seen, the sorrow and rage in her hollow eyes, it all made sense now. She was trapped, and somehow, I had become part of her torment. "But why me?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. "Why is she after me?" The man shifted slightly, his face still obscured, but there was a pause before he answered, almost as if he was choosing his words carefully. "You went where you weren't supposed to go. You heard what you weren't meant to hear. And now she thinks you can give her what she seeks. What does she want?" I pressed. "Freedom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But she can't have it. She belongs to the grave now. Her soul is lost, and nothing can change that. Yet she clings to the hope that someone, anyone, can release her." The weight of his words settled heavily on me, and I felt a rising sense of dread. I had disturbed something ancient, something powerful, and now it was bound to me. The woman's sorrow wasn't just grief, it was a desperate plea for something she could never have. I took a step back, trying to process everything. "So what do I do? How do I stop her?" The man took a step forward, his presence filling the room with a coldness that made my skin prickle. "You don't," he said, his voice firm. "There is no stopping her. All you can do is survive." My heart sank. Survive. The word felt like a death sentence. How was I supposed to survive something that could appear out of nowhere, something that could reach across the veil between life and death? "There has to be a way," I insisted, my voice trembling with desperation. "You've dealt with her before, haven't you? You stopped her once. You can stop her again." The man's silence was answer enough. He stepped fully into the room, and for the first time, the shadows around his face shifted, revealing his features. He looked ancient. Not in the sense of age, but in a way that suggested he had seen things no human should ever see. His eyes were dark, sunken, filled with a depth of sorrow and weariness that matched the woman's. "I am not here to stop her," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. "I am here to watch. To make sure the cycle continues." I stared at him, horrified. "You're letting this happen? You're just going to stand by and watch her torment me?" His gaze didn't waver. "It is the way of things. There are rules, ancient ones, that even I cannot break. She is bound to her fate, just as I am bound to mine." My mind reeled. I felt sick, a rising panic clawing at my insides. This man, this thing, wasn't here to help me. He was here to observe. To witness whatever horrors were about to unfold, but not to intervene. "Why me?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "Why did you let this happen to me?" He tilted his head, as if considering my question. "You were drawn to her," he said. "She called to you, and you answered. You were curious. But curiosity comes with a price." I backed away, shaking my head. "This can't be happening. There has to be a way to stop it. There has to be." He said nothing, but his eyes held a terrible truth. There was no way out. Not now. Not after I had been marked. "Get out," I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. "Leave. Now." The man didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me with those ancient, unreadable eyes. But then, slowly, he turned and walked back toward the door. Just before he stepped outside, he glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Remember," he said softly, "she will return. And when she does, you must not listen to her cries." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the cold, silent house. I stood there, trembling, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating me. She would return. I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, as the realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And when she came back, I might not survive. Part 9: The Return. For the next few days, I lived in a state of constant dread. Every creak, every gust of wind, every shadow seemed like an omen. I was on edge, jumping at the smallest sounds, my nerves fraying by the hour. Sleep became impossible. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the woman from the graveyard, her hollow eyes, her hands stretching out for me, the sorrow in her voice laced with something darker, more malevolent. But worst of all, I could still hear the words of the man who called himself the Watcher echoing in my mind, "She will return." And I knew he was right. It wasn't a matter of if. It was when. 3 nights after his visit, I finally broke. The tension became unbearable, like a coiled spring wound too tight, ready to snap. I hadn't left the house, hadn't even dared to step outside for fear of what might be waiting in the shadows. My phone was filled with missed calls from Danny, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. How could I explain to him that there was no way out? That I was trapped in something far darker than either of us had ever imagined? It was just past midnight when the silence in the house changed. The stillness I'd been clinging to so desperately felt wrong, too thick, too oppressive. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the darkened hallway outside my door. The lights in the house were off, but I hadn't dared to sleep. Not with the promise of her return looming over me like a death sentence. Then I heard it. The faintest sound. A whisper on the wind. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I strained to listen. It was soft at first, so quiet I could have convinced myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew what it was. It was her. The sobbing. The same broken, grief-stricken weeping that had chased me through the streets the last time. Only this time, it was inside. Somewhere deep within the house. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I wanted to run, to throw open the door and flee, but I knew there was nowhere to go. She would find me, no matter where I hid. Don't listen to her cries. The watcher's warning echoed in my mind, but it was impossible to ignore the sound. The sobbing was soft at first, like the distant wail of someone mourning a terrible loss. But with each passing second, it grew louder, more desperate, more real. It wasn't just coming from the hall anymore. It was moving, drifting through the walls like a living thing, searching for me. I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. This isn't real, I whispered to myself. This isn't real. But it was real. The cold air around me, the weight of her presence pressing in on me from all sides, I could feel it. I could feel her. The sobbing grew louder, more insistent. I could hear her now, just outside the door, her breath ragged and choked with tears. And then, her voice. Please help me! The words cut through me like a knife. My hands shook as I gripped the edges of the bed, my heart racing with a mixture of terror and pity. She sounded so broken, so lost. It was as though all the pain in the world had been poured into that single cry for help. But I couldn't move. I couldn't answer. The watcher's warning was clear: don't listen to her cries. I bit down on my lip, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. The door to my room rattled softly as if something on the other side was brushing against it, testing it. Her sobbing became louder, more frantic, and then, the knock. It was faint at first, like someone tapping on the door with trembling fingers. Then it came again, harder, more insistent. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of icy dread wash over me. Please let me in. Her voice was just a whisper, but it was filled with a sadness so deep, it felt like it could swallow the world. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. I'm so cold. The knock grew louder, shaking the door. She was right there, right on the other side. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I hurt you, please help me. Her voice cracked with emotion, and for a moment, I felt something stir inside me, a fleeting sympathy, a momentary lapse of reason. What if she was telling the truth? What if she really was sorry? What if she was just lost? But I knew better. I had seen the rage in her eyes, felt the coldness of her touch. This wasn't sorrow. This was something far more dangerous, far more malevolent. Something using her sorrow as a lure. Don't listen to her. The sobbing grew louder, the knocking more frantic, as if she was trying to break down the door. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just need someone. Her voice cracked again, and suddenly, the knocking stopped. Silence fell over the house like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its weight. I opened my eyes, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. For a moment, I thought it was over. That she had given up. Then I heard the whisper. It was so faint, I barely caught it, but it was there. A voice, low and insidious, like the hiss of a snake. Look at me! My blood ran cold. Don't look. Don't ever look. My heart raced as I squeezed my eyes shut again, refusing to obey the voice. The urge to look, to open the door, was overwhelming. It felt like every fiber of my being was screaming at me to look, to see what was waiting on the other side. Please, she whispered again, her voice filled with a twisted kind of sweetness. Just look. The door creaked, the handle rattling softly, as though it was about to give way at any moment. I pressed my hands harder against my ears, biting down on my lip until I tasted blood. Don't look. Don't look. And then, with a loud crack, the door flew open. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't move. But I could feel her there, standing just inches away from me, the air around me growing colder with each passing second. The sobbing had stopped, replaced by silence so thick, it felt like the world had been muted. She was there, waiting for me to open my eyes, waiting for me to make that one fatal mistake. "Please," she whispered, her breath cold against my skin. "Look at me." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. She was so close, I could feel the cold radiating off her, seeping into my bones. Then, something changed. The air around me shifted, and suddenly, I felt warmth, a soft, gentle heat that seemed to push back the cold. And with it, a voice. "Don't." It wasn't her voice. It was his. The Watcher. And just like that, the cold was gone. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath, and found myself alone. The door was still closed, the room empty. But I could feel it, the lingering presence of the woman, of the Watcher. This wasn't over. Not yet. But for now, I had survived. Part 10, the final night. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling, staring at the door that had never really opened. Time had lost all meaning, the minutes blending into hours as I waited for the next knock, the next whisper. But it never came. The house remained deathly silent, but the tension in the air was suffocating, like the calm before a storm. She wasn't gone. I could feel it in my bones. She was waiting. I wanted to believe the Watcher's presence had saved me, that he had somehow stopped her. But deep down, I knew the truth, he was just delaying the inevitable. She would come back. And when she did, I wasn't sure if I'd survive another encounter. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I had to get out, to run, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was lurking in the shadows. But even as I stood up, I felt it, the pull. It was faint, like a whisper tugging at the edge of my mind, calling me back to the cemetery. I fought it at first, terrified of what I'd find if I returned. But the feeling grew stronger, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore. The cemetery was where it had all started, and deep down, I knew it was where it would end. Grabbing my coat, I forced myself to leave the house, stepping out into the cold night. The streets were empty, bathed in pale moonlight, but I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me as I walked. The air was thick with anticipation, like the whole world was holding its breath. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, creaking softly in the wind. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run. But the pull was too strong now, an invisible force guiding my steps toward the iron gates. The cemetery seemed darker than before, the gravestones casting long, jagged shadows across the frost-covered ground. I hesitated at the entrance, staring into the black abyss beyond the gate. For a moment, I considered turning back, going anywhere else. But I knew that if I didn't face her now, she would follow me for the rest of my life. There was no escaping this. With a deep breath, I stepped through the gates. The cemetery was silent, the air unnaturally still. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my feet as I walked between the rows of gravestones, each one more worn and crumbling than the last. The pull was stronger here, like invisible hands guiding me deeper into the heart of the graveyard. And then I saw it, the grave from my dreams. It looked older than the others, the headstone cracked and covered in moss, almost swallowed by the earth. But it was unmistakable. The same grave that had haunted my nightmares, the same name etched into the stone, my name. I stopped in front of it, my breath catching in my throat. This was it. This was where she had been leading me all along. But why? Why was my name on the stone? What did she want from me? Before I could process the thought, I heard it, the sobbing. Soft at first, like a distant echo, but growing louder with every passing second. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew she was there, standing just behind me, her hollow eyes fixed on the back of my head. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling with sorrow. "I didn't want this." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay still. I couldn't run. Not now. I had to face her. Slowly, I turned to look at her. She stood there, her tattered dress fluttering in the cold wind, her dark hair hanging limply over her face. Her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of understanding. She wasn't just a ghost. She was a victim. I just wanted to be free, she whispered, taking a step closer. But I can't. Not without you. My heart pounded in my chest as her words sank in. She wasn't just haunting me. She was trying to trade places. No, I whispered, shaking my head. I can't help you. You can't, she pleaded, her voice breaking. I've been trapped here for so long. I just want to leave. Her hand reached out toward me, her fingers trembling with desperation. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, the Watcher, standing in the shadows, just beyond the graves. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting to see what I would do. I knew then that I had a choice. I could reach out and take her hand, let her pull me into her world, let her take my place in the living. Or I could turn away, leave her trapped in her misery forever. The wind howled through the cemetery, a cold, biting gust that seemed to carry her cries with it. I felt my hand lift, almost without thinking, as if some part of me wanted to give in, to end this once and for all. But something stopped me. A voice, quiet but firm. My own voice. Don't look. Don't listen. Don't give in. I took a step back, pulling my hand away from her reach. The sorrow in her eyes twisted into something darker, something angry. You have to, she hissed, her voice no longer pleading but demanding. You have to take my place. I shook my head, my voice steady now. No. I won't. Her face contorted with rage, her hollow eyes burning with fury as she reached for me again. But this time, I didn't flinch. I turned and walked away, back toward the gate, refusing to look back, even as her screams echoed behind me. I'll never leave you, she shrieked, her voice filled with a terrible, vengeful hate. I'll haunt you until you're dead. You'll never be free. But as I crossed the threshold of the gate, something changed. The air around me warmed, the coldness lifting like a veil. Her cries faded into the distance, and for the first time in days I felt light. Free. I glanced back once, just for a moment, and saw the cemetery behind me, silent and still. The Watcher was gone, and so was she. For now. I knew she wasn't gone forever. The connection between us wasn't something that could be easily severed. But I had made my choice, and for now, that was enough. I had survived. But deep down, I knew the truth. She would return. She always did. The end.